And here I am in Moldova, a country that very few people know much about, but a very, very interesting place. It's Europe's poorest country, and out of countries that count the number of tourists they get, it's the second least in the world. But first, some history. In many ways, Moldova is not a natural country. The entity called Moldova with its current borders is actually only one part of a larger area called Moldova, which is one of the regions of Romania, like everyone's favourite Transylvania. So this raises the question, should Moldova be a country? According to Charles King of Georgetown University, Moldovans have no distinct literature, no separate language, no history, apart from that of the states and empires of which they have been a part. The idea of Moldova as a thing started in 1924 when the Soviet Union took a slice of what was then Soviet Ukraine and called it the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The communist Soviets were trying to undermine capitalist Romania. The Soviets were arguing that the Moldovans were a separate people and should split off from filthy capitalist Romania and join the warm socialist embrace of the Soviet Union. The Moldovans should be liberated because, of course, the Soviet Union was all about national self-determination.
Early this morning, the Soviet troops launched a general attack on Hungary.
The problem was that the new Moldovan Republic was actually mainly Ukrainian. Less than a third of the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic was actually Moldovan. Despite this, the Soviets mounted a full-strength propaganda attack to assert that, yeah, Moldova is totally a thing. Then in 1939, when the Soviets and the Germans signed a non-aggression pact, the Germans made their Romanian allies give more of Moldova to the Soviet Union. So now half of Greater Moldova was in Moldova, the Soviet Socialist Republic, and half was in Romania. The borders remain the same today, with Moldova the country only being one part of Moldova the region. And through it all, Moldova has never been more than 68% Moldovan. Russians, Ukrainians, Bulgarians, Jews, Gagauz, and others make up the rest. Of course, after World War II, Romania was communist and in the Soviet sphere of influence, so there was no need for the Soviets to try and break it up. The Soviets relaxed the effort to assert that Moldova is a thing, and Moldova became a quiet backwater of the Soviet Union. Simultaneously during this period, Moldova became more divided between speakers of Moldovan and the minorities, most of whom spoke Russian, and this would get pretty relevant with the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm here in Transdnistria, a country which is not a country. Technically I'm in Moldova, but the Moldovan government has no jurisdiction here or no authority whatsoever, actually. Transnistria is a breakaway region. It has its own government and police and military, as well as passports, license plates, national anthem and flag. But not a single other UN country recognizes it as its own country. So how did we get here? As the Soviet Union was collapsing in 1989, the Moldovans asserted their independence by making Moldovan the sole state language and transitioning to the Latin alphabet. Now though, this really scared the other minorities, most of whom spoke Russian, and were worried that they were going to be linguistically disadvantaged. The even bigger worry though was that Moldova would reunite with Romania. Then they would really be minorities. Why were they worried? It's not like Moldova had just adopted the national anthem, official language and flag of Romania. They actually just did that. Moldovans were having a national movement, and they were saying, we are not Moldovan. The conflict was strongest in the industrial area called Transdnistria, and by 1992 had erupted into full-scale warfare. More than 1,000 people were killed and 130,000 displaced. And Transnistria has been self-governing but unrecognized ever since. Russia's 14th Army is stationed in Transnistria, and about 3/4 of Transnistria's budget comes directly or indirectly from Russian subsidies. And the Transnistrian population has actually voted in successive referendums to join with Russia. As it stands though, Putin and Russia probably prefer things stay as they are to keep Moldova out of NATO and Russia as the biggest player in the region's future. And that is how you get a small slice of 300,000 people in Eastern Europe living in a country which is not a country. Coming to Transnistria is a lot like stepping back in time. It was one of the most Sovietized parts of the Soviet Union, and in 1991 it supported the coup against Gorbachev in Moscow to try and preserve the USSR. Since then, in a lot of ways, it just kind of seems stuck in time. There are statues of Lenin, like this one that you can see behind me, and it's the only country in the world to still have the hammer and sickle on its flag. And then there are the gypsies. One of Moldova's few kind of tourist attractions is Gypsy Hill in the northern town of Soroca, considered Europe's unofficial capital of the Roma community. Here, Roma have used their money to build elaborate mansions. I was told that they don't have to pay taxes until the houses are finished, so they leave them uncompleted. You can see mansions inspired by St. Peter's Basilica, the Bolshoi, and the US Capitol building. Almost nobody that I talk to believes that Moldova is going in the right direction or that the future will be better than the past. It has a rapidly shrinking population because of a low birth rate and immigration. Already a quarter of GDP is remittances, people working overseas and sending money back. By some estimates, half the workforce lives in another country. At independence, Moldova had a population of about 4.3 million. Now it might be below 3 million. But the biggest reason for people's pessimism is corruption. In recent years, one presidential candidate has offered another presidential candidate $10 million to switch sides. A prime minister has had to resign after being accused of forging his high school diploma. And in the 2014 election, a clone party was created to confuse elderly voters. In 2015, news emerged that Moldova had suffered what might be the biggest bank fraud of all time anywhere relative to the size of an economy. An eighth of GDP, that's $1 billion, had disappeared from 3 banks, and it soon became obvious that it went right to the top of Moldova's political and business elite. The biggest money laundering operation ever uncovered in Eastern Europe was called the Russian Laundromat. At least $20 billion of Russian money was laundered through a Latvian bank account and 21 hub companies to 91 different countries. The transactions were all authorized by people inside Moldovan banks. The alleged architect of the scheme and one of Moldova's richest men, the Israeli-born Ilan Shor, was taken into house arrest and then, and I'm not kidding you, won a local election to be town mayor. According to whistleblowers, Moldovan judges, prosecutors and politicians were involved, as well as Russian officials and insiders, and the real total of laundered money may be as high as $80 billion. To stop the entire banking system falling over, the National Bank of Moldova then had to inject hundreds of millions of taxpayer money into the banks. In the following financial distress, 2 public hospitals in the capital had to briefly close all departments except for emergency services and surgery, and many of the foreign governments and aid agencies that bankrolled the Moldovan government suspended their support because of the corruption. The 2016 election was a contest between a pro-Russian candidate and the anti-corruption campaigner Maya Sandu. Polls show that Sandu was seen as the least corrupt candidate in the country, but of course she lost after the opposition brought in people to vote from Transdnistria and ballot papers in Moldovan embassies overseas mysteriously disappeared.
Lou Bega! Moldova! Are you ready? I'm gonna go now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everybody in the house.
They have one big cow,
Yeah?
and 2 little cow. The duck, yeah. They eat chicken, duck, rabbit. This is his children.
Oh,
He loves everybody.
oh, looks like a fox.
So what will happen to Moldova in the future? Will it turn towards Europe or will it turn towards Russia? And will it be able to break free from its corruption and its population decline? Will it be reabsorbed by Romania? Nobody knows, but for the time being, it's a pretty interesting place.